400 years ago, in a city thick with plague and ambition and danger, one man looked directly into the distance between who we are and who we pretend to be. He did not soften it or explain it away. He held up a mirror so exact in its psychological clarity that we are still seeing ourselves inside it. His name was William Shakespeare. Not a myth or a monument, but a man under pressure, shaped by loss and social fracture and relentless expectation, who chose not to close his wounds but to write from within them. To understand the mirror he built, we must begin not with fame, but with a fall. Stratford-upon England, 1564. This is not a grand city. It is not London with its 200,000 souls in its towers and its smell of river commerce and dangerous ambition. Stratford is a market town of roughly 2,000 people, bound together by the rhythms of wool trading and agriculture and the firm authority of the Church of England. The streets are narrow and the houses lean toward each other across the lanes as if whispering secrets they would rather not say aloud. In winter, the mud is deep enough to swallow a boot. In summer, the river Avon moves slow and green through the meadows at the edge of town, indifferent to everything happening on its banks. Into this world, on an April morning in 1564, a child was born to a glovemaker and his wife. The glovemaker was John Shakespeare, and John Shakespeare is the first key to understanding his son, because John Shakespeare was a man in motion. At the time of his son's birth, he was rising. He was a craftsman of genuine skill and considerable local ambition, a man who had worked his way up through the civic hierarchy of Stratford, from Alcester to Constable to Chamberlain, handling the town's finances, and finally to High Bailiff, which was the closest thing Stratford possessed to a mayor. He was respected and he was known, and he had married above himself, taking as his wife Mary Arden, the daughter of a gentleman farmer of real social standing. The Shakespeares were not wealthy, but they were visible. They occupied the kind of local prominence that felt, from the inside, like something solid, like a foundation that would hold. The house on Henley Street where William was born still stands, or at least its bones still stand beneath centuries of preservation and interpretation. It is not large, but it is substantial, the home of a man who understood the importance of appearances. The workshop where John worked, his leather, occupied the ground floor. The smell of it, animal and sharp and somehow permanent, would have been the smell of William's earliest consciousness. The texture of cured hide, the sounds of the trade moving through the walls below. The constant quiet reminder that this family's standing in the world was not inherited, but purchased. Purchased with skilled hands and commercial shrewdness and the sustained performance of respectability. This detail matters enormously, this detail about where the money came from and what maintaining it required. Because William Shakespeare grew up watching his father perform the role of respectable civic authority every single day, and he grew up understanding, in the wordless way that children understand the truth beneath their parents' performances, that the public face and the private reality did not always match, that the man who stood as High Bailiff of Stratford in the council chamber could be a different man entirely in the back rooms, where the real pressures of life were managed. Something happened to John Shakespeare in the 1570s. The historians have argued about the precise cause for centuries without arriving at a final answer. Some point to evidence of crypto-Catholic practice, the dangerous act of maintaining the old faith secretly in a Protestant nation, where doing so was not merely unfashionable but potentially lethal. Others point to straightforward financial mismanagement and accumulating debt. Others suggest a combination of both, private, religious conviction generating legal vulnerability, Legal vulnerability generating financial exposure. Financial exposure generating a slow and humiliating withdrawal from the public life he had worked so hard to build. What we know with certainty is the shape of the fall. John Shakespeare stopped attending council meetings. He applied for a coat of arms that would have formally confirmed his gentility and then withdrew the application. Debts accumulated and property was mortgaged and sold. The man who had stood as high bailiff began to shrink, to contract, to move through his town as a figure of diminished authority and quietly desperate circumstances. And William, his eldest surviving son, watched all of it. He was approximately 12 years old when the decline became undeniable. Old enough to understand what was happening. Old enough to feel the specific shame that children feel when a parent's public standing dissolves. Old enough to notice the way neighbors' expressions shifted almost imperceptibly when the Shakespeares walked past. Old enough to understand with a child's brutal precision that the world operated on two levels simultaneously. The surface that people showed each other, and the truth that moved beneath it. Quiet and relentless, and not particularly interested in anyone's dignity. This is what psychologists would call a formative wound. And it is not incidental to Shakespeare's later work, it is the engine of it. Because the gap between public performance and private reality, between what a person projects and what a person actually is the central subject of virtually every significant play Shakespeare ever wrote. Hamlet performing madness while experiencing something that might actually be madness. Macbeth performing kingly confidence while his interior world collapses into hallucination. Iago performing loyalty while engineering the systematic destruction of everyone around him. King Lear performing authority long after the authority has already been quietly surrendered. Shakespeare did not discover this theme in books. He learned it on Henley Street, watching his father's carefully constructed mask develop its first irreparable cracks. At the King's New School in Stratford, William Shakespeare received an education that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely demanding. The grammar school curriculum of 16th century England was built on classical Latin literature. Not a polite survey of the ancient world, but a total and sustained immersion. Cicero for rhetoric and the mechanics of persuasion. Ovid for transformation and desire and the psychology of identity in flux. Virgil for epic grandeur. Terence and Plautus for the intricate mechanics of comedy. Seneca for the architecture of tragedy and the interior landscape of extreme psychological states. 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, beginning at 6 in the morning in the summer months. The method was as important as the material. Students were not asked to read these texts passively or reverently. They were asked to inhabit them, to translate them, to imitate them. To take a passage of Cicero and dissect with precision exactly how the argument worked, which rhetorical device generated which emotional effect. Why this particular word in this particular position created more persuasive force than a different word in a different position, and then to write their own versions, and then to perform them aloud before the assembled class. Think about what this does to a particular kind of mind, a mind that is already, by temperament and by the specific experience of watching its father's public performance, crack under private pressure. Attuned to the gap between appearance and reality. A mind that has already learned through lived experience to watch people carefully, to read the distance between what is said and what is meant. Suddenly, that mind is given the formal tools of language as a technology, taught explicitly and systematically that words are not merely descriptions but instruments, that rhetoric is not decoration but engineering. that the precise selection and arrangement of language can move an audience to pity or to fury, or to laughter or to a recognition about themselves that they did not anticipate and cannot easily dismiss. Shakespeare was not the most academically distinguished student in his school. We have no record suggesting that. What we can say with confidence is that the grammar school gave him something that would prove more consequential than academic distinction. It gave him the ability to see language as a machine, and to operate that machine with a precision that would eventually surpass anything his more formally educated contemporaries could achieve. He did not go to Oxford or Cambridge. He never would, and this absence, this lack of the credential that the literary establishment of Elizabethan England considered the essential mark of a serious writer, would follow him into London as both a wound and a weapon. The wound would drive him. The weapon would eventually silence his critics. In November of 1582, William Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway. He was 18 years old. She was 20. She was already pregnant with their first child. The special license required for the speed of the ceremony cost 40 shillings. There is a version of this story that romanticizes these facts into a passionate rural love affair between a young man and an older woman. There is another version that reduces them to a cautionary tale about an ambitious young man trapped by circumstance and obligation before he had any real opportunity to understand his own potential. Both versions are too simple. The psychological reality was almost certainly more complicated than either narrative can contain. What we can say with genuine confidence is this: here was a young man of demonstrable intellectual gifts, a mind saturated in classical literature and already beginning to sense the dimensions of its own unusual capability, now facing the specific and compressive weight of early domestic responsibility in a provincial town at exactly the moment when whatever larger ambitions he may have already been nursing were still formless, still searching for their proper shape. Their daughter Susanna was born in May of 1583. Their twins, Hamlet and Judith, followed in February of 1585. William Shakespeare was 20 years old. He had 3 children, a wife, a father whose finances and social standing were in accelerating decline, a provincial market town, and a mind that was already, one suspects with some confidence, far too large and far too restless for the container in which life had placed it. Something had to give. Something was already, quietly and without announcement, beginning to break open, and then he disappeared. For 7 years, the most important writer in the English language vanished from the historical record entirely. And when he emerged on the other side, something had changed in him so fundamentally that it cannot be explained by time alone. Between approximately 1585 and 1592, William Shakespeare cannot be located in the historical record with any certainty. 7 years of complete biographical silence. Scholars have filled this void with every theory that ingenuity and professional dedication can produce. Some argue he was a schoolmaster in the country, teaching Latin to children in some provincial town while his mind worked simultaneously on larger problems. Others propose he served in a noble household, absorbing the manners and the psychology of the aristocratic world that would populate so many of his greatest plays. Others suggest he joined a company of traveling players and spent those years moving through the provinces, performing in market squares and guild halls and in yards, learning the craft of theatre from the inside out. We cannot confirm any of these theories. The honest position is uncertainty, but the uncertainty is itself a kind of evidence, because whatever was happening in those 7 years was not passive or accidental. The man who emerged in London in the early 1590s was not an apprentice feeling his way through a new profession. He was already, by every available indication, a writer of extraordinary capability and a theatrical professional of considerable practical experience. You do not arrive at that level of craft from nothing. The lost years were not an absence. They were an education conducted entirely outside any institution that would have kept records of it. And the most important thing that education appears to have produced is what we might call the gift of radical observation. Shakespeare came from outside the social world he would spend his career depicting. He was not an aristocrat. He was not a university man. He was not embedded in the court or the church or the legal establishment or any of the other great institutional structures of Elizabethan England. He was an outsider who had spent years watching all of them from the edges, listening to the way different registers of people actually spoke, noting the specific vocabulary of grief and ambition and desire and jealousy as it sounded in real human mouths rather than in literary conventions, designed to make literature sound like literature. This is the mirror maker's essential preparation. Before you can build a mirror that shows human beings themselves with genuine precision, you have to learn to see them without the distortions that familiarity and belonging always produce. You have to watch from outside the glass. When Shakespeare arrived in London, the city was simultaneously the most electrifying and the most dangerous place in England. It had a population approaching 200,000 people, compressed into a space that had not been designed to hold them and was visibly straining at every boundary. The streets were narrow and dark and smelled of river mud and animal waste and the smoke of 10,000 fires burning simultaneously. The gap between the wealthy and the destitute was not a statistical abstraction in this city, but a physical reality visible on every corner. Sometimes within the same building, a merchant's prosperous household occupying the upper floors of a structure, whose ground floor served as a slaughterhouse or a tannery. The bubonic plague was not an occasional visitor to this city. It was a permanent resident that came in waves, each one capable of killing thousands in a matter of weeks, closing the theatres, emptying the streets, transforming the crowded vitality of London into something spectral and silent and faintly unreal. In 1593, the plague killed 11,000 Londoners. In 1603, it would kill 30,000. Shakespeare would spend his entire London career navigating around these catastrophes, watching the authorities close his theatres, losing colleagues and perhaps friends, and returning to work the moment the death count finally permitted it. And then there were the theatres themselves, the great circular wooden structures of the South Bank, technically outside the jurisdiction of the City of London, which had never fully approved of theatrical performance. The Rose, the Swan, later the Globe. These were extraordinary buildings open to the sky and capable of holding 2,000 to 3,000 people at a single performance, ranging from the groundlings who stood in the yard for a penny to the wealthy patrons in the covered galleries above. They were not genteel spaces. They were loud and physical and viscerally alive, smelling of the crowd and the river, subject to the weather and the competing acoustics of real urban life pressing in from every direction. Into this world Shakespeare arrived, and by all contemporary accounts he arrived not as a figure of established authority, but as exactly what Robert Greene, one of the established literary men of London, called him in a bitter pamphlet in 1592, an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. That phrase, that specific bile, that professional contempt, carefully chosen and publicly deployed. It is one of the most psychologically revealing documents we have from Shakespeare's early career. Because Greene was not describing an You do not write furious published pamphlets about people who do not constitute a genuine threat to you. Greene was describing a man who had already risen far enough to threaten those who considered themselves his intellectual and educational superiors. And the particular sting of the accusation was explicitly social. A man of no university education, a provincial actor with a craftsman father, daring to write plays that competed on equal terms with the work of Oxford-trained poets and Cambridge-educated dramatists. The upstart crow had been told he did not belong. He had been told that before, in a schoolyard in Stratford. In the declining finances of a family struggling to maintain appearances it could no longer afford. In the social calculus of a world that assigned a person's value before they had any opportunity to demonstrate it. He knew exactly what to do with that feeling. He had been converting it into fuel his entire life. The Elizabethan theatrical world was not a free market operating on the clean logic of merit and audience preference. It was a patronage system in which theatre companies existed under the protection of noble or royal patrons whose names they bore and whose social and political influence shielded them from the consistently hostile attention of city authorities who would have preferred to close the theatres entirely on grounds of public disorder, moral corruption, and the undesirable mixing of social classes that large public entertainments tended to produce. Shakespeare joined the Lord Chamberlain's men, a company formed in 1594 under the patronage of Henry Carey, the Lord Chamberlain himself. And this professional affiliation represented a moment of significant and consequential stability. Shakespeare was not simply a contracted writer delivering scripts on demand. He was a shareholder in the company, meaning his income was tied directly to the company's commercial success. He had a direct and personal financial stake in making audiences come and come back, in holding them for the full duration of a performance, in giving them something they could not find anywhere else. This business reality is absolutely fundamental to understanding why his art works the way it works. Shakespeare was not writing for posterity, or for critical approbation, or for the judgment of future centuries. He was writing for a Tuesday afternoon crowd of 2,000 Londoners who had paid their penny and expected to be gripped from the opening moments. If they were not gripped, they would leave. They would talk through the performance. They would throw things. They had done so before with other writers who misjudged the contract. The financial pressure to hold an audience shaped every structural decision he ever made. Every moment of comic relief placed inside a tragedy to release the tension before it became unbearable. Every acceleration of pace when explanation threatened to bog the narrative in place. Every carefully constructed cliffhanger at the end of a scene that made walking away before the next one feel like deprivation. The Globe was not a library or a lecture hall, it was an arena. And Shakespeare the craftsman understood that distinction at the deepest level of his daily practice. While the theatres were periodically closed by plague, and Shakespeare was writing plays at a rate that suggests a mind operating at maximum sustained capacity, he was also producing something else. Something he apparently never intended for publication in the form that eventually occurred without his oversight in 1609. He was writing the sonnets, 154 poems addressed to two figures whose real identities remain genuinely unknown after 4 centuries of determined scholarly investigation. A young man of beauty and elevated social standing, sometimes called the fair youth, and a woman of dark complexion and magnetic, but morally complicated character, sometimes called the Dark Lady. The poems trace what appears to be the arc of two real emotional relationships with a psychological specificity that literary convention alone cannot account for. The sonnets are the most intimate document we have from Shakespeare's entire life. They are also the most psychologically unguarded, where the plays distribute their creator across dozens of different characters and maintain the protective distance of dramatic fiction. The sonnets collapse that distance entirely. The speaker of the sonnets is exposed in a way that Shakespeare nowhere else permits himself to be exposed. He describes desire with a self-awareness that makes him complicit in his own objectification of what he desires. He describes jealousy as a physical sensation, something that exists in the body before it organizes itself into coherent thought. He describes with unflinching precision the specific quality of loving someone who does not love you back, and knowing this with complete clarity and continuing anyway. And he describes time, obsessively, relentlessly, as a force against which he is constructing these very poems as a kind of desperate architectural defense. Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day is not primarily a poem about beauty. It is a poem about mortality, about the fact that a summer's day ends, about the specific terror of a consciousness that understands impermanence with a clarity so complete that it cannot be converted into acceptance or peace. The sonnets reveal a man living in acute and permanent awareness of his own mortality, a man for whom the passage of time was not a philosophical abstraction but a felt presence in the body, something that pressed against him every time he sat down at the desk. And they reveal, perhaps most importantly, that the same extraordinary intelligence that made him the most penetrating observer of other people's psychology was also turned, without mercy or special treatment, upon himself. The mirror was not only pointed outward, he looked into it himself every day, and he wrote what he saw there without flinching. But the years that were about to begin would push that intelligence into territory so dark that even Shakespeare himself may not have anticipated what he would find there. Because in the summer of 1596, something happened that cracked the world open, and the man who emerged from that crack was capable of writing things that no one before him had ever written, and no one since has fully surpassed. In August of 1596, Shakespeare's only son Hamlet died. He was 11 years old. The historical record offers nothing in direct response to this fact. No letter survives, no diary entry, no contemporary account of a father's response to the death of his only son. The documents that exist from that period are all practical and commercial and legal. Property transactions and professional arrangements, and the administrative business of a man who continued to function in the world. The silence around the grief is total, and that silence is one of the most haunting and most revealing things about Shakespeare's entire biography, because the man who would spend the rest of his career creating the most psychologically precise portraits of grief in the English language left no direct testimony about the most devastating personal loss of his own life. What he left instead were the plays in King John, written in the period following Hamlet's death. There is a character named Constance who has lost her young son, and what Shakespeare gives her is something that no playwright before him had attempted with anything approaching this precision. A portrait of grief so accurate in its psychological texture, so true in its description of how a parent's mind works when it refuses to accept the finality of a child's death, that it bypasses literary convention entirely and lands directly in the body of anyone who has ever lost something they could not accept losing. Grief fills the room up of my absent child, Constance says, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. This is not literary grief constructed to satisfy dramatic convention. This is documented grief. This is the precise phenomenology of what happens to a parent's mind in the months following the death of a child. The way the imagination refuses to process the absence. The way it keeps generating the presence that the body can no longer verify. The way grief is not passive sadness, but active hallucination. A mind insisting on a reality that no longer exists because the alternative is too large to inhabit. This is a clinical description of a psychological state that therapists and neurologists would not develop adequate professional vocabulary for until centuries after Shakespeare described it. He wrote it from the inside. And for years after Hamlet's death, he began writing a play about a young man whose name was almost identical to his dead son's. A play about grief and the specific inability to move through grief. And the way that grief can calcify inside a mind so intelligent and so precise that it cannot stop thinking about what has been lost long enough to accept that it has gone forever. He called it Hamlet. Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, is one of the most analyzed characters in the history of literature. And the reason is not that he is conventionally heroic, or that his circumstances are uniquely extreme. The reason is that he thinks in a way that every human being in every audience since 1600 has immediately and uncomfortably recognized as their own. He thinks too much. He analyzes his own paralysis with a precision that generates more paralysis. He watches himself failing to act, and then analyzes his own watching of his failure. He is aware of his own performance even while he is performing it, genuinely uncertain whether the grief he displays is authentic or theatrical, whether the madness he enacts is calculated fiction or something that has crossed the line into actual disintegration, whether the revenge he contemplates is justice or merely another form of the corruption he is ostensibly trying to oppose. To be or not to be is not, as popular culture has reduced it to, a meditation on the desirability of suicide. It is a meditation on the terrible cost of a mind too conscious of its own operations to act with the simplicity that action requires. It is the inner monologue of a human being paralyzed, not by cowardice or weakness, but by the opposite, by a capacity to see with such clarity into the consequences of every possible action, that no action feels adequate to the full weight of what he sees. This is the mirror turned outward in its most psychologically devastating form. Because every person who has ever felt capable of understanding a situation far better than they were capable of responding to it, every person who has ever watched themselves performing a version of themselves and genuinely wondered whether the performance was the only version that existed, every person who has ever been unable to determine where their genuine feeling ended and their performance of feeling began, every one of those people looks at Hamlet and sees themselves looking back. This is what Shakespeare discovered in the period following Hamlet's death. Not a theatrical technique or a structural innovation, but a truth. The truth that human consciousness is not a single unified thing that moves cleanly from perception to decision to action. It is a stage in itself, a stage on which multiple competing versions of the self perform simultaneously, each one watching the others, none of them entirely in control, all of them pretending with varying degrees of conviction to be the real one. He had been building this mirror for years. Now he understood with the clarity that only great loss can produce what it was actually for. In Othello, Shakespeare performed an act of psychological surgery, so precise that it would not be fully comprehended for another 4 centuries. He took a man of genuine greatness, a military commander of proven and demonstrated courage, a man who had risen from the absolute margins of Venetian society to a position of extraordinary authority through nothing but demonstrated capability and force of character. And he showed exactly how such a man who had built everything himself from nothing, could be destroyed from the inside by the very foundation of his own achievement. Othello is not destroyed by Iago's lies. The lies are only the mechanism. He is destroyed by the specific vulnerability that his achievement has always contained. He is a black man in a white Venetian world. He has achieved everything he possesses through performance, through the sustained demonstration of capability in a context that did not naturally extend him standing or welcome. And some part of him, the part that Iago identifies with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon finding the exact point of weakness in a structure, has never fully believed that he deserves what he has achieved, has never felt that his position is genuinely and permanently his. When Iago begins to plant the seeds of doubt about Desdemona's fidelity, he is not planting seeds in foreign soil. He is watering something that was already there, already growing quietly in the dark. The suspicion that a man of Othello's origins could not truly deserve a woman of Desdemona's world. The terror that the world's recognition of him has always been conditional and revocable, always dependent on a performance of worthiness that might at any moment be exposed as insufficient, as less than what was required. This is what contemporary psychology would call imposter syndrome taken to its lethal and irreversible extreme. And Shakespeare was the first writer in the history of literature to dramatize the precise internal mechanics of it with this degree of accuracy. He understood it, one suspects, because he had lived adjacent to it his entire professional life. The provincial without a university degree, the craftsman's son competing with learned men for the same audiences and the same recognition. The upstart crow who had built a career and a reputation that part of him may always have felt he had no right to hold. He had spent 20 years performing a version of himself competent and confident enough to survive. In a world that had not initially offered him a welcome, he knew from the inside what it felt like to have achieved something that a persistent internal voice kept quietly insisting you had no right to have. He put that knowledge into Othello, and the result is not entertainment. It is a document of human psychology so accurate that it could serve, without significant translation, as a clinical case study. In Macbeth, Shakespeare investigated the most dangerous architecture in the human mind, the structure that forms in the interval between the contemplation of a serious transgression and the moment of committing it, and then, far more devastatingly, the structure that forms in the long aftermath. In Macbeth, he wanted to know with absolute precision what happens to the interior world of a human being when they deliberately cross a line that every part of them knows they should not cross. And what he found was not the simple guilt of a morality tale. What he found was something more specific and more terrifying than simple guilt. He found the discovery that the human mind cannot be evacuated of what it knows about itself. That consciousness is not selective in the way that convenience would require it to be. That the rational faculty a person uses to plan and justify and execute a transgression is the identical faculty that will subsequently and endlessly replay that transgression, unable to generate any framework in which it becomes acceptable, unable to construct any future in which it is no longer factually true. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth do not descend into madness because of supernatural forces working upon them from outside. They descend because they are psychologically healthy enough to know exactly what they have done. The witches do not create Macbeth's ambition, they reveal it to him. They hold up a mirror and show him a version of himself that was already there, already waiting, already wanting. The dagger he sees before him is not the hallucination of a disturbed and broken mind. It is the projection of a consciousness that has already made a decision. It cannot unmake and is watching itself make that decision in terrible slow motion. Lady Macbeth, who appears at first to be the stronger and less sentimental of the two, who openly mocks her husband's hesitation and takes some practical charge of the moral logistics of murder with a frightening efficiency, is eventually destroyed by precisely the psychological capacity she believed she had successfully suppressed. Out, damned spot. She sleepwalks through the corridors of her castle, trying to wash blood from her hands that no one else can see. Driven into psychosis not by weakness, but by the immune system of a conscience she was convinced she had switched off. Shakespeare knew that you cannot switch off a conscience. You can silence it temporarily. You can suppress it with sufficient force of will for long enough to commit the act the conscience was trying to prevent. But it keeps running in the background, like water finding its level, like a tide that does not care about the barriers you have built. Eventually it rises. Eventually it shows you everything you tried not to see. He had been watching human beings run from themselves his entire life, watching them construct elaborate performances of innocence over the top of what they actually knew about themselves. And he knew that no one ever truly outran the mirror. But Macbeth and Othello and Hamlet, devastating as they were not the furthest point of the abyss Shakespeare was descending into during these years. There was one more step, one more play, and it would take everything he had learned about human suffering and push it to a place that audiences then and now have found almost unbearable to sit inside. There is a moment in King Lear that breaks something in an audience that has never encountered it before. It is not a death or a revelation or a dramatic reversal. It is a question. An old man, stripped of his kingdom and his dignity and the love of his daughters and the warmth of a roof over his head and finally of his own sanity, stands on a storm-battered heath and asks the indifferent elements why they are doing this to him. He knows on some level that the storm does not hear him. He knows the universe is not listening and will not answer. He asks anyway. He has to ask. He is a human being and human beings. When the world falls completely and finally apart, ask why, even when they know there is no why. Especially then, King Lear, written around 1605, is the play in which Shakespeare dismantled every consoling lie that Western civilization had constructed about the relationship between human virtue and human suffering, about the existence of justice as an operating principle in the universe, about the universe's fundamental investment in whether individual lives end well or badly. Cordelia, the one genuinely good character in the play, dies anyway, not because she made a fatal mistake or failed to be sufficiently good, but because the world does not protect the good as a matter of operating principle, because goodness is not a shield against the randomness of catastrophe, because the universe is not a court of justice, and virtue is not a currency that can be reliably exchanged for safety. These are the hardest propositions any artist can state, and Shakespeare stated them unflinchingly in front of audiences who needed desperately to believe the opposite. He held up the mirror, and what it showed was not comfort and was not false hope. Shakespeare was approximately 41 when he wrote King Lear. He had been living in London for 15 years and watching the political world of Elizabethan England with the attentive precision of a man who understood from long experience that power was simultaneously fascinating and lethal. He had written plays that examined power so critically that Richard II had been performed by supporters of the Essex Rebellion in 1601 as propaganda for deposing a living monarch. He had navigated the terrifying proximity to political catastrophe that this association generated with a caution that speaks volumes about his intelligence and his instinct for survival. And in 1603, the old world ended. Elizabeth I died after 45 years on the throne, and James I of Scotland became James I of England, and everything in the political and cultural atmosphere shifted. Shakespeare's company was renamed the King's Men and found themselves performing at court with a frequency that spoke to genuine royal favor and carried its own complicated weight of proximity and obligation, and the specific pressures of being visible to power. It was in this atmosphere, in this new dispensation of power and old anxiety and the particular philosophical darkness that descends on a person in their 40s, who has looked at the world long enough to stop expecting it to be better than it is, that Shakespeare wrote King Lear. He was not writing about a legendary British king. He was writing about every human being who has ever believed that love is permanent, and that the world owes them recognition proportional to what they have given it, that a life lived with sufficient effort and sufficient loyalty should end in warmth and gratitude rather than exposure and cruelty and the howling indifference of a storm. He was writing about the discovery that these beliefs are not facts about the world. They are wishes about the world, and the universe does not honor wishes. To understand the courage that was required to write King Lear, you have to understand the world in which it was written and performed. Elizabethan and Jacobean England was not a society that tolerated political criticism with equanimity. Writers had been imprisoned and had their ears surgically removed for plays deemed offensive to those in authority. Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare's greatest contemporary and in many ways his genuine intellectual equal, had died under deeply mysterious circumstances. In 1593, that many historians connect to his involvement in government intelligence work and the dangerous, overlapping territories of Elizabethan politics and theatre. Shakespeare navigated this world with extraordinary and deliberate care. His plays examined power and the corruption of power and the gap between a ruler's self-image and their actual conduct, with a penetration that would be explicitly and immediately dangerous if stated directly in a pamphlet or a public speech. But Shakespeare never stated it directly. He displaced it always into historical settings and legendary kingdoms and Italian city-states and the Rome of Caesar and the ancient Britain of Lear, setting his critiques far enough from the contemporary moment that no specific living person could claim direct injury, while ensuring that the psychological dynamics were close enough to the present that any thinking person in the audience could feel the application without being told to feel it. This was not cowardice. It was the strategic intelligence of a man who understood that the way to tell the deepest truth about power was not to write a pamphlet that could be seized and burned, but to build a mirror, to create an experience so emotionally powerful and so psychologically immediate that the clarity it produced would outlast any specific political moment it was responding to and would continue working on audiences long after the specific circumstances that generated it had dissolved into history. He understood something that propagandists have never understood, that art which tells people what to think is always less powerful than art that makes people see clearly enough to think for themselves. The mirror does not argue, the mirror simply shows, and what people see in it, they cannot unsee. What was all of this costing him personally? This sustained act of looking without flinching, this daily discipline of sitting down and opening the wound and writing from inside it for an audience of thousands who thought they were watching a play and did not know they were being shown themselves. This is the question that the biographical record makes most difficult to answer with any precision, because Shakespeare maintained a silence about his interior life so consistent and so complete that it feels deliberate. Where other writers of his period were voluble and sometimes exhausting in their self-presentation, where Ben Jonson wrote with frank and occasionally overwhelming self-importance about his own genius and his own suffering and his own grievances, Shakespeare wrote plays. He distributed himself across characters. He gave his loneliness to Hamlet and his jealousy to Othello, and his grief to Constance and his rage to Lear, and his guilt to Macbeth, and his capacity for forgiveness to Prospero. He vanished entirely into the work, but certain facts suggest the outlines of an interior life under considerable and sustained pressure. He was living in London for most of his professional career while his wife and children remained in Stratford, a separation that in practical terms meant weeks rather than hours between visits. The nature of his marriage after the circumstances of its beginning was never fully legible from outside, and remained so after centuries of scholarly attention. The death of Hamlet in 1596 was never directly addressed in any surviving document. The famous bequest to Anne in his will of his second best bed has generated more interpretive controversy than almost any other single fact in his biography without producing a consensus about what it actually meant. What we can say is that the man writing Hamlet and Othello and King Lear was not writing from a position of comfortable psychological distance. These are not the works of a person for whom the hardest questions about human existence are academic exercises conducted in comfort. They are the works of someone for whom grief and social precariousness, and the exhaustion of sustained performance, and the specific loneliness of maintaining a public identity across decades were not literary themes, but lived conditions. Someone who had felt the weight of all of it and kept working anyway, every day, for 20 years. But what happens to a person who has spent 20 years staring into the abyss of human nature and writing what they see there? What happens when the darkness has given everything it has to give and something genuinely new must be found? The answer surprised everyone who assumed Shakespeare would simply continue the trajectory. Because what came next was not more darkness. It was something stranger and in some ways more difficult than darkness had ever been. Around 1608, something shifted in Shakespeare's imagination. Something turned. He had spent the previous decade producing the great tragedies. King Lear and Macbeth and Othello and Hamlet. Plays that looked at the worst of human experience with an unflinching directness that had pushed his art to what felt like its absolute limit. And now, in his mid-40s, with his health possibly beginning to show the effects of 20 years of sustained creative intensity, with his life perhaps beginning to contract back toward Stratford and the things he had left there long ago, the direction of his imagination changed. He began writing differently the plays of this final period, what scholars call the late romances, or sometimes the last plays. Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, are not tragic in the way that Hamlet is tragic or Lear is tragic. They begin in catastrophe and suffering that is as genuinely dark as anything Shakespeare had previously written. But they move against the apparent logic of the worlds they inhabit. Toward something the tragedies refused entirely to offer, they move toward forgiveness. The Winter's Tale is perhaps the most extraordinary of these final plays. Leontes, a king, is seized by a paranoid jealousy as baseless and as total as Othello, and in the space of a few devastating scenes destroys everything he loves. His wife, his son, his closest friendship, his reputation, his peace, his future, his wife, Hermione, falsely accused of adultery and betrayal, apparently dies of grief in prison. His infant daughter is abandoned on a foreign shore in the middle of winter with no one to care for her. His son, Mamilius, catching the fever of his father's madness, sickens and dies, and then the play skips 16 years. A character called Time walks onto the stage and addresses the audience directly, stepping outside the fiction to acknowledge the impossibility of what the story is about to attempt. He asks the audience to accept the gap, to hold still and allow the play to do something that reality very rarely permits and perhaps has no obligation to permit. The daughter Perdita has grown up on that foreign shore and found love, Hermione. Not dead after all, but kept in hiding by a woman of extraordinary loyalty. Is presented in the final scene as a statue, a work of art. Leontes, who has spent 16 years in genuine and demonstrated contrition, is brought to see this statue of the wife he destroyed. He approaches it. He reaches out to touch the cold marble, and the statue breathes, Shakespeare himself, through the character presenting the statue. Signals clearly that this resurrection is not natural and does not pretend to be. It requires, he says, your faith. Your willingness to believe in the possibility of restoration, despite everything that makes restoration logically impossible. This is not sentimentality. This is not the comfort of a man who has lost his nerve and retreated from the hard truths of the tragedies. Shakespeare earned the right to this moment by writing Macbeth and King Lear first, by showing with absolute honesty and without flinching what human beings are capable of at their most destructive. And then, from inside that knowledge, from inside that complete and unflattering understanding, attempting the genuinely harder thing, the suggestion that the worst need not always be the final word. The mirror in the late plays does not show you only what is. It shows you, provisionally and without guarantee, what might still be possible. If the faith holds, if the time is sufficient, if the love is real enough and patient enough to wait for what it cannot force. The Tempest, written around 1610 to 1611, is the last play Shakespeare wrote entirely without a collaborator, and it is, in the reading of virtually every generation of scholars and audiences since, a farewell, not a simple one or a sentimental one, but a farewell nonetheless. Prospero, a duke who has spent 12 years on an island in magical exile, commands every element of the world around him with total authority. He controls the weather and commands spirits and shapes the reality experienced by everyone on the island, according to his own design and his own sense of what justice and education require. He is, in the most explicit way that Shakespeare ever constructed, a fictional surrogate, a figure for the playwright himself, the man who arranges and controls the experience of others, who creates the storm and the shipwreck and the comedy and the terror and the revelation, who decides who suffers and when the suffering ends, who holds in his hands the power to show people versions of themselves they would not otherwise encounter. And at the end of the play, Prospero breaks his staff. He drowns his book of magic in the ocean. He releases his power entirely, and he delivers the epilogue directly to the audience, stepping outside the fiction and asking them, as an individual human being standing alone on the stage, to release him from the island with their applause. Now my charms are all overthrown, he says, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint, what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. This is not the triumphant announcement of a great artist retiring at the summit of his powers. This is the speech of a human being acknowledging honestly what the work has taken. what the sustained act of holding up the mirror for other people across 20 years of relentless creative effort costs the person whose hands are doing the holding. The weakness is real, the faintness is real, and the request for release, for the mercy and approval of the audience that will finally allow him to rest, is real. He had spent 20 years building the most psychologically precise mirror in the English language, and now, finally, he was ready to set it down. Around 1613, Shakespeare largely withdrew from the London theatrical world and returned to Stratford, to New Place, the large and substantial house he had purchased in 1597 as a deliberate statement of restored family standing, the second largest house in town. As if the specific humiliation of watching his father's public position dissolve across his childhood could be answered, finally, in the only language the world had ever consistently respected, the language of property and position and visible material success. He was 49 years old. He had accumulated considerable wealth and property, including shares in the Globe Theatre and substantial farmland around Stratford. He had established his family's gentility with a coat of arms obtained in 1596. The same year his son Hamlet died, he had given his daughters lives of stability and some comfort. He had outlasted most of his rivals and contemporaries. He had survived the plague and the political dangers and the professional competition and the relentless pressure of producing work of the highest quality at commercial speed for 20 consecutive years. And he was done, or nearly done. He would collaborate on a small number of additional plays, contributing scenes to the work of younger writers in his company. But the great sustained excavation was over. The 20-year project of looking into the mirror and writing what he saw there, conducted in public, in verse, before audiences who thought they were being entertained, was finished. What those final years in Stratford were actually like, emotionally and psychologically, we do not know. The biographical silence that has characterized the entire life continues without relief. There are property documents and legal records and the famous dispute about a promised consignment of grain and his will, drawn up in January of 1616. A careful and legally precise document distributing his estate with attention to social consequence and the continuation of the family's position. And there is the bequest to Anne of the second best bed, which scholars have argued about for centuries without resolution. It may have been an insult or a term of endearment, or simply the bed they actually slept in together. The best bed being kept for guests, as was the Elizabethan custom. We do not know, we will never know. Shakespeare, the man who revealed the interior life of every human type he ever created, kept his own interior life as his last and most carefully guarded private territory. He died in April of 1616. He was 52 years old. The man was gone. But what he had built did not die with him. What happened next was something that no one, not Shakespeare himself with all his understanding of how legacies are constructed, could have fully anticipated, because the mirror he had built turned out to be genuinely indestructible, and the image it showed turned out to be the image that every subsequent generation of human beings needed to see. 7 years after Shakespeare's death, 2 men saved half of literature. John Heminges and Henry Condell had been Shakespeare's professional colleagues in the Lord, Chamberlain's men and then the King's men for decades. They had worked alongside him and performed his plays and watched him write and known him in the particular and irreplaceable way that people who share a daily working life know each other. And in 1623, motivated by what their dedication to the volume describes simply as care and pain to have collected and published them, they gathered 36 of Shakespeare's plays and published them as the first folio. Without this single act of deliberate professional friendship and editorial labor, approximately half of Shakespeare's surviving work would be permanently lost, including Macbeth, including Twelfth Night, including The Tempest, including Julius Caesar, including As You Like It. The plays existed as working theatrical scripts, not literary documents intended for preservation. Many had never been printed in any authorized form. They were not objects that the culture of 1616 would have identified as requiring careful preservation for future centuries. They were working tools of a living trade, not monuments to be maintained. Hemminges and Condell understood something that Shakespeare himself apparently did not prioritize: that the plays were not simply entertainment that had already fulfilled its purpose in the moment of performance. They were something that needed to survive beyond the immediate theatrical moment. They were the mirror, and mirrors need people willing to protect them from the ordinary indifference of time. 400 years have passed since Shakespeare's death. The world he inhabited is almost entirely gone. The specific political structures and the religious anxieties and the social hierarchies and the theatrical conventions and the very form of the English language as he wrote it, all of it transformed beyond recognition. New literatures have emerged in every century since his death, each reflecting the concerns and the consciousness of its own historical moment with its own distinctive precision and power. And yet Shakespeare remains, not as a museum piece that culture maintains out of obligation, not as a credential that education requires people to endure, but as something that living human beings in every generation and on every continent continue to choose to engage with, to perform, to adapt, to argue about, to find themselves inside with a recognition that surprises them. Why? The answer is not simple, but it has a center. And the center is this: Shakespeare understood something about the architecture of human psychological experience that does not belong to any particular historical moment, because it belongs to the structure of consciousness itself. He understood that the gap between who we are and who we perform to be is not a modern problem generated by social media or late capitalism or any other specifically contemporary condition. It is the permanent and ineradicable condition of being a self-aware creature in a social world. He understood that ambition and love and guilt and jealousy and grief and the terror of mortality and the desperate hunger for genuine recognition are not products of any specific century. They are the permanent weather of being alive in a human body with a human mind capable of reflecting on itself. He understood that the most honest thing a person can do is look into the mirror without flinching and see what is actually there. And the most generous thing an artist can do is build a mirror so clear and so precisely made and so beautifully constructed that other people can look into it and finally see themselves without the usual distortions of vanity and fear and wishful thinking. He did not flatter what he saw. He did not soften it or protect his audiences from it. He showed Hamlet paralyzed by his own extraordinary intelligence. He showed Othello destroying what he loved because he could never truly believe he deserved it. He showed Macbeth discovering that guilt is not an external punishment but an internal architecture that the mind builds around itself. He showed King Lear learning at terrible cost and far too late that love cannot be commanded or purchased or made conditional without destroying the very thing it was supposed to secure. He showed Lady Macbeth discovering that a conscience cannot be permanently suppressed, that it keeps running in the dark, that it rises and then, in the final plays, from inside all of that knowledge, from inside all of that honest and unflattering clarity, he showed something stranger and harder than any of it. The possibility that after all the loss and destruction and grief and guilt, there might still be, in the right circumstances, with the right faith and the right willingness to wait longer than seems bearable, something that looked like restoration, something that looked like a life continuing after the worst has already happened. He showed the full range, not a flattering portrait designed to make human beings feel good about themselves, not a damning indictment designed to confirm the worst, but the full range, held up with the steady and unflinching precision of a man who had looked at human beings for his entire adult life without ever losing his capacity to be both devastated and astonished by what he saw. We live in the 21st century in a world that Shakespeare would find simultaneously alien and immediately recognizable. We live in a world of unprecedented and ubiquitous performance. Social media has given every human being a stage on which to present the curated and managed version of themselves, the highlight reel, the performance of happiness and success and meaningful connection, while the real interior life continues behind the performance, unaddressed, increasingly isolated by the very technology that promises intimacy and connection but delivers something structurally quite different. We perform our identities in public with a sophistication and a self-consciousness that would have been impossible in any previous century. And we are, as a result, more anxious about the gap between the performance and the reality than perhaps any generation in history. Shakespeare understood this gap before there was a word for it. He understood it because he had lived it in a world where your position in the social hierarchy determined your survival and where the performance of the right identity was not an aesthetic choice but a daily existential necessity. He understood the cost of the performance and the specific loneliness of the performer and what happens to a consciousness when the performance and the reality have diverged so far and for so long that the person performing can no longer locate themselves beneath the role they are playing. That is why Hamlet still lands. That is why Macbeth still lands. That is why King Lear, in its unsparing refusal to offer false consolation, still hits with the force of something newly discovered rather than something long known and filed away. Because we are still performing, we are still living inside the gap. We are still asking the same questions that Shakespeare asked from his desk in Southwark 400 years ago, with a candle burning down to its socket and the city outside continuing its vast and indifferent roar. Who am I beneath the role I am playing? What does it cost to maintain a performance across an entire life? What is the relationship between what I show and what I actually am? And is it possible, after everything, to be seen without the performance, to be genuinely known? These are not Elizabethan questions. They are not historical questions. They are human questions. And Shakespeare is still the most precise and the most honest and the most psychologically penetrating person who has ever attempted to answer them. There is a peculiar and slightly unsettling thing that happens when you spend serious, sustained time inside Shakespeare's work. You begin to notice that the mirror does not only show you the characters on the stage, it shows you yourself watching the characters. It catches you in the act of recognition and then asks, quietly but without relenting, what you intend to do with what you have just recognized. This is not a comfortable experience. It was never meant to be. A mirror that shows you only what you want to see is not a mirror at all. It is a flattering portrait, and Shakespeare was never interested in flattering portraits. He was interested in the thing itself, the actual human being beneath the performance, the actual grief beneath the social composure, the actual ambition beneath the modest and carefully managed presentation, the actual fear beneath the projected confidence, the actual love beneath the power struggle, The actual loneliness beneath the crowded and apparently successful life, he spent his entire career looking for it. In history and in legend and in the Italian novellas he adapted, and in the classical texts he had absorbed as a schoolboy in Stratford, and in the faces of the 2,000 Londoners who stood in the Globe's yard every afternoon and watched themselves on his stage without quite realizing that was what they were doing, and what he found again and again at the center of every character he ever created, from the greatest king to the smallest comic servant, was not a hero or a villain or a saint or a monster. What he found was a person, complicated and contradictory, and capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary love, frightened by the things that threaten the performance, aching for the recognition that the performance is supposed to produce, longing underneath everything to be seen without the performance, to be known without the mask, to exist in someone else's perception as something real rather than something constructed. That is what Shakespeare was looking for. That is what every human being who has ever looked honestly into a mirror has been looking for, and that is why, 400 years after a glover's son from Stratford set down his quill for the last time and walked away from the desk and back into the ordinary life of a provincial market town, the mirror he built is still there, still clear, still precise, still unbroken, still showing us exactly who we are. The question is not whether you are willing to look. The question is whether, once you have looked, you can bear to look away. If this journey into the mind and the mirror of William Shakespeare has stirred something in you, if it has made you look even briefly at your own performance with the same unflinching attention that Shakespeare brought every day to his characters, then you already understand why these stories still matter, not as history to be observed from a safe distance, not as cultural obligation to be discharged, but as instruction, as the only technology we have ever developed for seeing ourselves with genuine clarity. This channel exists for exactly that purpose. Every figure we examine here is a mirror. Every life we excavate together is an opportunity to understand something about the architecture of human ambition and human failure and human resilience that is as alive and as pressing today as it was in the century that produced it. If you want to continue looking, subscribe and leave a comment below telling us which moment in Shakespeare's story you found most recognizable in your own life. Because that recognition is the entire point. That is what he was building the mirror for. And if you know someone who is living inside the gap between their performance and their reality, and who needs to be reminded that they are not alone in that gap, share this with them. Because the mirror is for everyone. It always was. It was built for everyone. Stay with us. The next story is already being written, and it will hold up the glass again